Morgan Peckma, Editor-in-Chief of City and State, and this is Last Look. Yesterday, City and State hosted a panel on education, focusing on the Common Core, the next chancellor, and many of the most important education issues facing New York City and New York State. The following are some excerpts from that panel discussion. We hope you enjoy.
We know education is is probably the most important issue in this mayoral election. And I'm going to jump in very quickly on Common Core, which obviously is the new buzz phrase in education. First it was No Child Left Behind, then it was Race to the Top, and now everybody's talking about Common Core. So starting with Meryl, what do you think of Common Core, and what do you think of its implementation so far in New York City and New York State?
Well, I think Common Core is not a new topic in New York State. I see former Commissioner David Steiner here. David Steiner, myself, Michael Mulgrew, and then Chancellor Joel Klein went to Washington how many years ago, David? 3 years ago. And New York State then said, as part of its winning application for Race to the Top dollars, that we would implement Common Core as part of a drive to higher standards. We have stood by our commitment in New York State. We have an aggressive timeline for implementation. But you asked the question about, I think, the significance of Common Core in the daily lives of schools, principals, parents, children, superintendents. And I would say that we are having a beginning of the implementation of Common Core standards. This is a higher standard. It is going to take time to implement effectively. Our focus is going to be, quite frankly, on productive professional development around the implementation of Common Core. We need to reach out to parents so that they understand the expectations of Common Core. We need to do a great job communicating why these new test scores that you've just seen are not an indicator that there's been no learning and teaching going on. This is a baseline about a next standard, and I am proud that New York State is leading that conversation nationally.
Thank you, Ron. So I just want to follow up. So, Michael Mulgrew, I've talked to your colleague, Randy Weingarten, about Common Core, and she and I agree that perhaps it could have been phased in more effectively so it wasn't a shock to the system this year. How do you feel about that?
I agree that the implementation could have been done more effectively, but I want to go back a little bit because my original work when I worked for the union was when No Child Left Behind legislation came out, and every state was required to submit a consolidated application on how we would comply with the No Child Left Behind legislation. That legislation was flawed because of the inability of the federal government to say what criteria should be used for whether a state system is doing well or not doing well. That led to the Common Core idea, because what happened when No Child Left Behind, as it more and more was being phased in, all of a sudden states who were doing very little investment in education were seen as great because they had lowered their standards as to what was appropriate for a child to learn. So that's what the impotence really of politics and education. You put those two things together and usually it's games that happen and children who suffer because of it. So the Common Core was an idea to say if states would voluntarily agree that these were the standards that children needed to learn to be successful in the world in which they have to live. So now when you hear the Common Core debate, everyone forgets what the original genesis was. And it is a good idea, and it needs to happen for us as a country. Implementation-wise, as a teacher, you have your standards. You should then have a curriculum that is flexible for people to use, teachers to use with different students based on their needs, and then you design the testing around it. What we did here as a country, and you've seen this, and New York State is out in front, is we have the standards and the test, no curriculum. So that should have been done much differently, but the problem was that the politics were involved around it, and people want to rush out and act like they're getting things done. We, as a state, wanted to get out in front of it. We did tell, and it is not the state education department's responsibility to supply local school districts with curriculum. It is the local school district. Could you imagine if we tried to tell every school district what curriculum they were teaching? Parents would get really upset. Right. So it was up to the local school districts, who have not done a good job at all on this issue. So it's now the children who are suffering because of it. People will say we might have a new baseline, it's just a new beginning, we're starting it, but you're still not dealing with the human face of this as a child who is being told they did great all year, they went to school for 180 days, perfect attendance, did all their homework, did everything, and now because of a single test result, they're being told they're not proficient. And we should have been able to figure a way around that, but the politics were all so muddled and so pushing, but it could have been done better. And I'm hoping, and I know that other states were speaking to a great deal. Randy Weingarten and I have done a lot of conversations with other state leaders to try to get in front of this situation. But do not, and this is what frightens me, this debate about whether Common Core is good or bad. It is a good thing. And do not convolute the tests and what's going on now with the idea of what Common Core is supposed to do, and if we do it correctly in the end, it will benefit our country and all the children inside of it.
I was wondering, do any of our panelists disagree with that fundamental, assumption that Common Core is good for the system? Okay, well,
See, no name calling. Sorry,
hey.
You set the bar so high.
Yeah, exactly.
Just speaking of the politics of it, we have Senator Flanagan here. I mean, we see, throughout New York State, obviously in New York, everybody was quite shocked that the proficiency was 31%, but there's other districts upstate where it was 5% and 10%. Why the wide disparity? Question to you, Senator Flanagan.
I concur with Michael Mulgrew, and it's interesting from a legislative perspective. I have a lot of people now sending emails, coming to our office, some announced, some unannounced, people who are lamenting Common Core and who speak stridently in opposition. Yeah. Having said that, I feel like almost all the educational leaders that I interact with have been fundamentally very strongly supportive of Common Core, and I think that's a good thing. The implementation is a totally separate subject, as Michael mentioned, but if you look at the test scores that just came out, the achievement gap that you're referring to existed before these scores came out. Mm-hmm. There's not a real marked difference. There are problems in all corners of the state, some rural, some urban, some suburban. If you look at Rochester, for example, their graduation rates prior to these scores coming out they're abysmal. It's an embarrassment for the state of New York and really for all of us who work in education. I certainly come from Long Island and represent my own home communities, but in chairing this committee, I've spent a lot of time traveling around the state, and we had an achievement gap before, and in speaking with the Chancellor often and with Commissioner King, it's not always about money, because in many of these areas where the scores are not very good, in fact they're abysmal, there's a lot of money being spent and a lot of money being spent per student. For me, one of the core components is educational leadership, and how a school is run, how the administrators work, the quality of the teaching staff has a direct impact on what the achievement level will be. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether you live in Long Island or Plattsburgh or Buffalo. I think the educational leadership question is an absolutely critical one that continues to need to be addressed.
To be clear, some charter schools did amazingly well, and some charter schools did amazingly poorly on the exam. But I do think that chartering at its essence is the notion of a group of people being able to come together and set and create a school that they believe works the way a school should work. And the fact is, we have to look at what success is doing, particularly around literacy. Eva Moskowitz's schools those scores cannot be explained away by demographic differences or enrollment structure differences. There may be some difference in how charters, and there are some differences in how charters and district schools operate. We've been very clear, and I think the charter sector has been very clear and transparent about that. But something good is going on there in literacy in particular, and I suspect it is the curriculum. I suspect it is that Eva, as a former history professor, takes seriously the notion that kids should read good books, should be able to think. One of the most courageous things she did early on was she was using a very standardized reading program, and it was getting good results, and she started asking kids, do you comprehend, rather than are you just able to decipher and read? And what she found is they couldn't tell her what the story was about, and she built her own curriculum basically from scratch so that kids were able, and she tested to see, could they comprehend? were they able to think? Were they able to relate back an entire story? Were they able to understand the themes? And I think we have to look at the schools that are succeeding, and that goes district schools, obviously, and charter schools as well.